There are moments in life when you feel something changing deep inside you, something quiet yet powerful, not something the world can see immediately, but something heaven clearly recognizes. I want to begin with a simple truth. When God begins to lift your spirit, certain things cannot stay in your life anymore. Many people pray for blessings. Many people ask God to change their circumstances, but very few understand that the first miracle God performs is not around you, it is within you. I remember hearing a story about a man who had struggled with fear, anger, and constant failure. Everywhere he went, conflict followed him. His relationships broke, his dreams collapsed, and he believed the world was against him. But one day he encountered the presence of God in prayer, not a loud thunder, not a dramatic vision, just a quiet moment where his heart began to change. And as his spirit began to rise in faith, something strange started happening. The same problems that used to chase him just slowly disappeared. The same toxic voices around him faded away. The same fears that once controlled him lost their power. Why? Because when your spiritual vibration rises in God's presence, certain things simply cannot survive near you anymore. Darkness cannot stay where light enters, doubt cannot stay where faith grows, and negativity cannot remain where the Spirit of God begins to move. Today, I want to share something powerful with you. When your vibration truly rises, when your spirit aligns with God's presence, 8 things will begin to disappear from your life automatically. Not because you forced them out, not because you fought harder, but because your spirit has stepped into a higher atmosphere. And when you understand this spiritual law, your life will never be the same again. So open your heart, lean in, and listen carefully. Because the next few minutes may reveal why certain battles in your life were never meant to be fought. They were meant to disappear when your spirit rises. There is something mysterious that begins to happen when your spiritual vibration starts to rise in the presence of God. It is not always loud and it is not always visible at first, but the change begins quietly inside your heart. When your spirit begins to align with God's truth, the atmosphere around your life slowly starts to shift. And one of the first things that begins to disappear is toxic relationships. Many people spend years trying to fix people who were never meant to stay in their lives. They pray harder, they try to be more patient, they try to explain themselves again and again, hoping that one day the same people who hurt them will suddenly understand their heart. But spiritual growth reveals something important. Not every relationship is meant to grow with you. There are people who enter your life during seasons when your spirit is still searching, still wounded, still uncertain. During those moments, you may tolerate negativity because you are still learning your own value. You may accept criticism that slowly weakens your confidence. You may surround yourself with people who constantly drain your peace because deep inside you are still trying to find your identity. But when your vibration begins to rise through prayer, faith, and the presence of God, something inside you begins to awaken. Your spirit becomes more sensitive. The same words that once sounded normal now begin to feel heavy. The same conversations that once entertained you now feel empty. The same environments that once seemed comfortable suddenly feel exhausting. It is not because you have become proud. It is not because you think you are better than others. It is because your spirit is beginning to crave peace, truth, and purpose. Toxic relationships often survive on confusion, insecurity, and emotional dependence. When someone constantly criticizes you, manipulates you, or fills your mind with negativity, they are feeding on the lower atmosphere of your emotions. But when God begins to lift your spirit, that atmosphere starts to disappear. Imagine a room that has been dark for many years. The darkness feels normal because it is all you have known. But the moment light enters the room, the darkness has no power to fight it. It does not argue with the light. It does not resist the light. It simply disappears because it cannot exist in the same space. In the same way, when your spiritual vibration rises, the light of God's presence begins to fill your life. And people who were comfortable in darkness begin to feel uncomfortable around that light. Sometimes they will criticize you for changing. Sometimes they will say you are becoming distant. Sometimes they will accuse you of forgetting who you used to be. But what they are really sensing is that the version of you they once controlled is no longer available. There are friendships that survive on gossip, complaints, and constant negativity. When your spirit begins to rise, those conversations no longer bring you joy. Your heart starts to seek deeper discussions, encouragement, wisdom, and faith. The old patterns begin to feel empty, and slowly the distance between you and those people grows. Other relationships are built on manipulation. There are people who only feel secure when you doubt yourself. They feel comfortable when you constantly seek their approval. But when your connection with God grows stronger, your confidence no longer depends on human validation. You begin to walk with quiet assurance, knowing that your worth comes from the one who created you. And when that confidence appears, manipulation loses its power. You may notice that certain people call you less often. Some invitations stop coming. Certain conversations grow shorter and more distant. At first, this can feel painful because you are watching familiar connections slowly fade away. But what is really happening is not rejection, it is spiritual separation. God often removes voices that once influenced you because your future requires a different environment. Just as a seed cannot grow in poisoned soil, your purpose cannot flourish in relationships that constantly pull your spirit downward. When your vibration rises, you begin to recognize emotional patterns you once ignored. You see the difference between love and control. You recognize the difference between support and jealousy. Your spirit begins to discern what once felt confusing. This new awareness changes the energy of your presence. You stop reacting to drama the same way. You stop engaging in arguments that drain your peace. You stop explaining your worth to people who refuse to see it. And as this inner transformation continues, toxic relationships begin to fall away naturally, not because you fought every battle, but because your spirit has stepped into a higher atmosphere where those connections can no longer survive. Fear is one of the quietest chains that can hold a human life captive. It does not always shout loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind doubt, hesitation, or the constant feeling that something will go wrong. Many people live their entire lives under the shadow of fear without even realizing how deeply it controls their decisions, their dreams, and their faith. But when your spiritual vibration begins to rise through a deeper connection with God, something powerful begins to change inside you. Fear slowly starts losing its authority. In the early stages of faith, many believers still carry the weight of anxiety. They pray, but worry immediately returns. They trust God, yet their thoughts still imagine every possible disaster. It is not because their faith is fake. It is because the spirit is still learning to stand higher than the voice of fear. Fear feeds on uncertainty. It thrives when the future looks unclear. When a person focuses only on circumstances, problems begin to appear larger than God's promises. Bills look impossible to pay. Challenges seem too heavy to overcome. Even small obstacles begin to feel like mountains. But when your spiritual vibration rises, your perspective begins to shift. Prayer becomes more than a ritual. It becomes a place where your spirit reconnects with the authority of heaven. As you spend time in God's presence, something inside you begins to stabilize. The chaos in your thoughts slowly settles, and a deeper awareness begins to form. You start to remember that the same God who created the universe is the one guiding your life. When this truth moves from your mind into your spirit, fear begins to weaken. Situations that once caused panic no longer shake you the same way. Problems still exist, but they no longer control your emotional state. Think about a child walking through a dark street alone. Every shadow looks dangerous. Every sound feels threatening. The child's heart beats faster because fear fills the environment. But the moment the child's father arrives and begins walking beside them, the entire atmosphere changes. The street is still dark, the sounds are still there, yet the fear disappears because the child knows they are no longer alone. This is what happens when your vibration rises in God's presence. You begin to walk through life with the awareness that you are not facing anything by yourself. Fear often controls people by convincing them that they are powerless. It whispers that failure is inevitable. It reminds them of past mistakes and suggests that the future will repeat the same pain. Over time, those thoughts create invisible boundaries around a person's life. They stop taking risks. They stop pursuing dreams. They settle for safety instead of purpose. But when your spiritual awareness grows stronger, those mental chains begin to break. Faith begins to speak louder than fear. You start seeing challenges as opportunities for God to move. Instead of asking, what if everything goes wrong? Your heart begins asking, what if God is preparing something greater? This shift does not happen overnight. It grows gradually as your spirit becomes more aligned with truth. Every prayer strengthens your inner confidence. Every moment spent in God's presence reminds you that your life is guided by something greater than circumstances. Anxiety begins to lose its grip because your thoughts are no longer trapped in the worst possibilities. Your mind begins to focus on God's promises instead of imagined disasters. There are people who once lived with constant nervousness about the future. They worried about finances, health, relationships, and every unknown detail of life. Their minds were always preparing for the next problem before it even arrived. But when their spiritual vibration rose, they began to experience a different kind of peace. It was not the absence of problems, it was the presence of trust. They realized that worry had never solved their problems in the past. Fear had never created solutions. It had only drained their energy and stolen their joy. As faith grew stronger, courage quietly took the place of anxiety. They began making decisions with confidence rather than hesitation. They stopped allowing imagined fears to control real opportunities. When a person's spirit rises in alignment with God, fear can no longer dominate their thinking. The same situations that once produced panic now produce prayer. The same uncertainties that once created anxiety now inspire trust. The mind becomes calmer because it is anchored in something eternal rather than temporary. Fear cannot survive long in a heart that truly believes God is in control. As your spiritual vibration rises, anxiety begins to fade, and the quiet strength of faith begins to guide every step of your life. The human mind is one of the most powerful spaces God has given us. It is the place where dreams are born, where decisions are made, and where faith either grows or struggles to survive. Yet for many people, the mind becomes a battlefield filled with negative thinking patterns that quietly shape the direction of their entire life. Negative thoughts rarely appear suddenly. They grow slowly through experiences, disappointments, and the words people hear over time. A person fails once, and a small voice begins to whisper that they are not capable. Someone faces rejection, and the mind starts repeating the message that they are not worthy. Over the years, these thoughts form patterns that feel almost impossible to escape. Many individuals try to change their circumstances without realizing that the real struggle is happening inside their thinking. They work harder, chase new opportunities, and attempt to improve their lives externally, yet the same negative thoughts continue to follow them. Even when something good happens, the mind quickly searches for reasons why it might not last. But when your spiritual vibration begins to rise in the presence of God, something powerful begins to happen inside your mind. The patterns that once controlled your thinking slowly begin to lose their power. In the early stages of spiritual growth, many people still struggle with inner criticism. They may believe in God, but deep inside they still doubt themselves. Their thoughts constantly replay past failures. They compare themselves with others and feel like they are always behind. These patterns become so familiar that the person begins to accept them as normal. However, as your relationship with God grows deeper, your inner voice begins to change. Prayer, reflection, and the truth of Scripture start replacing the lies that once shaped your thinking. The mind that once focused only on problems begins to notice possibilities. The thoughts that once repeated failure begin to consider growth. Instead of assuming the worst outcome, your heart begins to expect that God can create a new path, even in difficult situations. This transformation happens because your perspective begins to align with a higher truth. When your vibration rises spiritually, your mind is no longer limited to human fears and past experiences. You begin to see your life through the lens of faith rather than defeat. Negative thinking thrives in an environment where hope is weak. It survives on constant reminders of what went wrong, what was lost, and what seems impossible. But faith introduces a completely different atmosphere. Faith reminds the mind that every failure can become a lesson. It reminds the heart that God often prepares blessings in ways people cannot immediately see. When this awareness grows stronger, the cycle of negativity begins to weaken. Imagine a person who has spent years believing they are not talented enough to succeed. Every time they consider trying something new, their mind immediately reminds them of previous mistakes. They hesitate, they doubt, and eventually they give up before even starting. But when their spiritual vibration rises through a deeper connection with God, they begin to see themselves differently. They start to believe that their abilities are not accidents but gifts. They begin to understand that growth comes through learning, not through perfection. The negative voice that once dominated their thinking becomes quieter. It still appears sometimes, but it no longer controls their decisions. Another common pattern of negative thinking is constant comparison. Many people measure their worth by looking at the achievements, success, or lifestyle of others. Social environments often amplify this habit, making people feel as if they are always behind someone else. When your spirit begins to rise, comparison begins to fade because your focus shifts toward purpose rather than competition. You begin to understand that God designed every life with a unique path. The journey of another person no longer defines your value. This awareness brings freedom to the mind. Instead of feeling discouraged by someone else's progress, you begin to appreciate your own process of growth. Over time, the thoughts that once filled your mind with criticism begin to disappear naturally. Not because you forced them away with constant effort, but because your spiritual awareness created a new mental environment. Your mind becomes a place where encouragement replaces doubt, where faith replaces constant worry, and where possibility replaces the limitations of the past. The more your vibration rises in alignment with God's presence, the more your thinking begins to reflect peace, confidence, and hope. The patterns of negativity that once shaped your identity gradually dissolve as your mind becomes renewed by a higher understanding of who you are and what God can do through your life. Every human life carries habits. Some habits build strength, discipline, and faith. Others quietly pull a person away from the life God intended. Many people know the difference between the two, yet they often struggle to break the patterns that weaken their spirit. They promise themselves they will change. They try again and again, but the same behaviors continue to return. Old habits have a powerful grip because they are built through repetition. Over time, they become comfortable, even when they are harmful. A person may recognize that a habit is damaging their peace, their relationships, or their spiritual life, yet stopping it feels almost impossible. The mind says it is wrong, but the pattern feels familiar. Some people try to fight these habits only with willpower. They set strict rules, make strong promises, and push themselves to change through sheer determination. Sometimes this works for a short time, but often the habit slowly returns. The struggle repeats itself, leaving the person feeling frustrated and discouraged. But when your spiritual vibration begins to rise through a deeper connection with God, something different begins to happen. Change no longer comes only from external effort. It begins to grow from inside your spirit. When your heart becomes more aligned with God's presence, your desires slowly start to transform. The things that once seemed enjoyable begin to lose their attraction. Activities that once felt normal begin to feel empty. This shift does not always happen instantly, but it grows stronger as your spirit becomes more sensitive. In the early stages of faith, many people still carry habits that distract them from their spiritual growth. They may spend time in environments that fill their minds with negativity. They may engage in behaviors that weaken their discipline or distance them from prayer and reflection. These patterns continue simply because they have been part of daily life for so long. However, as a person's spiritual vibration rises, awareness begins to increase. The conscience becomes clearer. The spirit begins to recognize which habits are building strength and which ones are slowly draining energy. This awareness changes the way a person experiences those habits. Something that once felt harmless begins to create discomfort inside the heart. The same activity that once brought temporary pleasure now leaves a feeling of emptiness afterward. It is similar to how a person's taste changes when they begin to care more about their health. Foods that once seemed enjoyable may suddenly feel too heavy or unnatural. The body begins to crave what nourishes it rather than what simply satisfies a moment of hunger. In the same way, when your spiritual life grows stronger, Your soul begins to crave what feeds your faith rather than what only entertains your emotions. Old habits often survive in environments where a person's attention is constantly distracted. When life is filled with noise, pressure, and endless activity, there is little space for reflection. Without reflection, habits continue automatically. But when you begin spending more time in prayer, quiet thought, and spiritual focus, you start seeing your life more clearly. You begin noticing how certain behaviors affect your peace, your mindset, and your connection with God. The more your spirit rises, the less comfortable those habits become. There are people who once spent hours surrounded by negative conversations, gossip, or unhealthy influences. For years, it felt normal because everyone around them participated in the same behavior. But as their spiritual awareness grew, they began feeling a quiet resistance inside their heart. Those environments no longer felt uplifting. Instead of leaving with excitement, they left feeling drained. Their spirit began seeking spaces where faith, encouragement, and wisdom were present. Gradually, the habits connected to those environments started disappearing. Other habits involve how a person handles stress or emotional pain. Some people turn to distractions that numb their feelings instead of facing them with honesty and prayer. These habits may provide temporary relief, but they never bring lasting peace. When your vibration rises spiritually, your way of responding to pressure begins to change. Instead of escaping from problems, you begin bringing them to God. Prayer replaces avoidance. Reflection replaces impulsive reactions. This shift weakens the habits that once controlled your responses. What makes this transformation powerful is that it happens naturally as your spirit grows. You do not feel forced to abandon the old patterns. Instead, they simply lose their influence over your choices. Your priorities begin to change. Time becomes more valuable. Your energy becomes focused on what strengthens your life rather than what drains it. As your connection with God deepens, your inner discipline grows stronger. You begin making decisions that protect your peace and support your purpose. The habits that once pulled you away from your spiritual path gradually fade because your spirit is now aligned with something higher than temporary comfort.